Hello and welcome to Crash Course World History, the show where I'm not sure if Crash Course is copyrighted and I'm not willing to take that risk. Today I'm going to be summarizing AP World History's ninth and final unit, Globalization, and this takes us from 1900 all the way to the present. Much of the change from 1900 to the present day can be attributed to advances in technology and the impacts that they had on society. It's widely known that the population of the world has ballooned over the past 200 years. I mean, look at this graph of population over time. This goes from the beginning of mankind, and as you can see, the population is largely stagnant, increasing by little bits, until the 20th century. Around the 20th century, it begins to absolutely skyrocket. This is due to many technological improvements that we're going to be talking about shortly, and that has allowed our population to balloon all the way to the 7 billion that we're at today. This influx is no accident, and it was technological improvements in the 20th century that enabled this growth. To start us off, the Second Agricultural Revolution, also known as the Green Revolution, modernized how we produce food. This was done through the invention of effective pesticides, hybrid crops, and genetic modifications to improve the size and quality of plants. These inventions increased the food supply, which could support the growing population. On the medical side, the invention of antibiotics prevented millions of deaths, but the medical progress that really affected the population was the improvements in childbirth. According to the CDC, between 1915 and 1997, the infant mortality rate dropped by upwards of 90%, which is truly a remarkable figure. The last improvement in technology that I'm going to note is the new ways in which energy became available. Nuclear power became a new way to access high amounts of energy, solar power, wind power, and many others also became available, but due to the improvements that made petroleum really cheap to refine, oil still remains king. With the improvements in the way that we understand medicine, countries made a conscious effort to clean up cities by implementing indoor plumbing, among other things. How it took humans thousands of years to realize that leaving feces in the street is unhealthy, I don't know. But regardless, conditions finally improved. This led to a drastic decrease in the amount of malaria and tuberculosis in cities that could afford the new public health precautions. The consequence of longer life expectancy, however, was an increase in cases of diseases like heart disease and Alzheimer's, both of which come with older age. And I can't finish talking about the public health without mentioning the 1918 Influenza Epidemic, which occurred after the finish of World War I and took more than twice as many lives as the war did. Bit of a sidebar here, the flu epidemic is widely known as the Spanish flu, which came to be not because the Spanish suffered the most deaths, but because the epidemic first started during the World War, which was still going on, and that meant that the press was tightly controlled. Since Spain was neutral, they were the only ones to document the influenza outbreak, and hence it became known as the Spanish flu. And no, that's not on the AP test, but if it was, you would know the answer. With the changes in technology and the booming population, the environment began to suffer, and people began to take note of it. Climate change, deforestation, desertification, among other things, became more prevalent. The dwindling supply of fossil fuels also became a matter of conflict, with oil reserves being on the forefront of many countries' minds. The final change I'd like to mention before moving into globalization itself is the reform movements all around the world during the 20th century. Encouraged by Western ideals, colonies all around the world were able to attain their independence from their colonizers and begin the fight for racial equity. During the 20th century, women would get the right to vote in most countries and would continue to fight for equal opportunities such as education. Speaking of education, it became more available to people all around the world, regardless of race, sex, etc. Unless of course you're a woman in the Middle East, in which case that fight's still ongoing. Regardless, the 20th century saw fantastic reforms, not just in first world countries, but in countries all around the world, inspired by Western ideals of independence, freedom, and innate rights. Now, on to the titular subject of this unit, globalization. What is globalization? Well, it's a good thing. Or a bad thing. Depends on who you ask, but it's definitely a thing. Globalization, generally speaking, refers to the shrinking of the world because of factors such as cell phones, the internet, planes, high-speed trains, mass media, social media, etc. These all make distance not a factor in communication, which in addition to allowing you to talk to your grandma who is on the other side of the country, it also allows corporations to advertise internationally, and talk to their grandmas overseas. This combined with shipping that is cheaper than ever has enabled the rise of global corporations. These are the big names, the Nestles, the Coca-Colas, the Nissans of the world, and these companies are very powerful because of how universal they are. Think about it. If you are ever lost in Kazakhstan and feel dazed and confused by the culture shock, you can take refuge in a McDonald's and know that you are surrounded by American culture. Speaking of American culture, despite how other countries like to mock Americans for not having any culture, the story of globalization can often be described as a story of Americanization. And I don't think that's a word, but I just made it up, so you get the gist. Many of these global corporations that have taken over so much of the world are American companies, and that's not even to mention the near monopoly the US has over the film industry. But it's not all American. There's Bollywood. The expansion of worldwide brands, as well as worldwide events, such as the Olympics, the World Cup, and even large concerts, has led to the emergence of a global culture largely defined by consumerism. The final thing that I'm going to talk about in this video is the institutions that have run the world during the time period that we've been talking about. I put those in quotations because, as you'll find out shortly, neither of these organizations have done a particularly amazing job at enforcing what they say they will. The first of these global organizations was the League of Nations, which was established in 1920 at the end of World War I and dissolved in 1946, shortly after World War II. The League of Nations was comprised of 42 nations and tasked itself with disarmament, which is a fancy word for decreasing the number of weapons, preventing war through collective security, settling disputes peacefully through diplomacy, and improving global welfare. At its heart, the League of Nations was created after World War I in order to prevent a, let's say, I don't know, like a hypothetical World War II, if that were to happen. And was it successful at its job? No. Onto the United Nations, established in 1945, and it still exists today in the present. It is comprised of a whopping 193 nations, also known as every country in the world except for the Vatican City and Palestine. The UN has two primary functions, the Security Council and the Court of Justice. The UN Security Council determines the existence of a threat and tries to solve it through peaceful diplomacy. And the UN Court of Justice tasks itself with settling disputes in accordance with international law. Now, you may wonder why I said these organizations haven't done a great job at enforcing these things, and that's because neither of these organizations have had a standing army. But instead, they use task force, which are essentially military personnel from states and the United Nations. That just about concludes Chapter 9 of AP World History. If you're a random person watching this who found it on the internet, I wish you the best on your AP test. You got this, easy. I haven't taken it yet, hopefully I'll do okay. And if you're my teacher grading this assignment, please have mercy on my soul. Regardless, thank you for watching, and have a great day.